What's up, my fellow emo, pop punk, metalcore music lovers? Matrix here, and you are locked into the Matrix Music Review Podcast, the only place to get your alt-rock music fix. And it is that time of year again. We are back for a mid-year best of list. So today we're going to talk all about the best live acts that I've seen this year, the best EPs that have been out this year. What are my top albums so far? And then we'll also talk about some top tracks, some tracks that I'm listening to. And I think I'm going to make you guys a playlist of the top tracks that I've been listening to this year as well so far. So that way, yeah, we have the Control-Alt-Save playlist, and that's where I add a lot of new music. But this one will be very specialized into what are my favorites that I've been listening to so far this year. Before I jump in, if anybody knows anything about Macs, if you have any suggestions as to how to fix a busted USB-C port on the laptop itself, shoot me a message, because I went to record this and one of my USB-Cs is busted completely. So it's kind of hard to keep charging and have to have the plug-in for all the mic and the other equipment that I have for this as well. So not really too sure what I'm going to do about that. Probably just have to go get it fixed somewhere. But hey, if there's an easier fix out there and somebody knows about it, shoot me a message, let me know. Be happy to hear from you and hopefully get this fixed pretty quickly. As always, the link to everything you need is in the description of this episode. All of my social media platforms are down there: Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Matrix Music Review. Instagram is the best place to keep up with me on a day-to-day basis. That's where I'm posting all the tour announcements, any new songs that I get throughout the week, and just staying in touch in general. That's the best place to get me. The link to the playlist Control-Alt-Save is in the description of this episode as well. Follow along over there on Spotify, and then I'll put the link to the new podcast in there, the new playlist in there as well, so that you can check out the best of so far. If you're listening on Apple Music or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. That helps boost the content out to everybody else in the world. And as I always do, I'm going to ask that you share this podcast with friends, family, anybody that you know that may need a podcast or may love alternative music. Introduce them to Matrix Music Review, and let's continue to grow our little community of alt-rock music lovers. With that, we're jumping into our best of the year so far, and the first thing we're going to talk about is live acts. One of my goals this year was to get out to a lot more live shows, and I feel like I've accomplished that so far. I don't have a number on the amount of shows that I've been to, but it's definitely into the double digits at this point, which is definitely more than I was at this time last year. And so, best of so far, obviously, looking at the Arrows in Action show I just went to 2 weeks ago, they are one of my favorite live acts to see. They were definitely at the top of the list. I got to check out Games We Play twice this year, once as an opener and then once as a side stage for Let's Go Fest, and both times super impressive band, really fun energy, and just an overall good time. So Games We Play is definitely one of those artists that you're going to hear mentioned a few times throughout this podcast as somebody that's really just exploded onto the scene this year. Speaking of openers, two of the openers that I saw on tour, Belmont and Young Karcher, really stood out in ways that almost made them shine above the headliners at that time. Definitely more so with Belmont than with Young Karcher, because between you and me, who was the headliner for that Young Karcher opening set was out of this world. But Belmont definitely stood out in the sense that they actually attracted more attention, more people, and had more energy than the Can't Swim set that I saw that night. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the two juggernauts and legends in the scene that I was able to catch live this year. First up was Fall Out Boy. The So Much for Toward Us tour was out of this world. That was where I saw Games We Play first. We also had Hot Mulligan and Jimmy Eat World, and then obviously Fall Out Boy. That tour was something special, and it's definitely one of those tours that I'll never forget. As well as the Sum 41 Farewell Tour I got to check out this year as well, and that was just such a good time because I had never seen Sum 41 live, and it kind of makes me sad that I never saw them live until this point, because they were so good and there was so much energy from them, and you could tell that the fans still just wanted more from them. So sad to see them go out, but also, thankful for all the years that we got from them. But if you're making me pick a favorite tour or a favorite band that I've seen this year, I don't think there's any question in my mind that the best tour that I've seen so far this year was the Black Tour, which was Of Virtue, Catch Your Breath, and Imminence. Of Virtue was one of those bands that really kind of came out of nowhere for me last year in terms of that album. It was in my top 20 last year, which I don't think I really expected to happen. Catch Your Breath is definitely one of those bands that is right on the edge of explosion into that Imminence, Sleep Token kind of area where they're just going to be absolutely gigantic. And then Imminence. Imminence in a live setting is must-see. There is no way around that. Imminence is a must-see live act, and I've never seen Sleep Token live. I imagine it's probably the same feeling when you see Sleep Token for the first time live, but I can very, very confidently say that Imminence, anytime that they are even relatively close to my area, I will definitely be going out for that tour. It is just an amazing experience, and it's really interesting to see how Eddie performs, and it's just so effortless. You know, it's not easy to play the violin on a good day, let alone play the violin, scream, and put vocals behind tracks while, you know, guitars are going, drums are going. It's not an easy thing. So to see how Eddie does that is just unbelievable. So Imminence definitely had the best live act that I've seen so far this year, but we'll see. Maybe by the end of the year, somebody overtakes them. The next category for our best of is EPs. So EPs are relatively short this year in terms of how many we've gotten. I feel like I haven't really seen a lot of EPs, or maybe I just haven't connected with a lot of them. You know, recently, obviously, we talked big time about the RODERIK EP and the Sunday Morning EP, as well as the Tarnish EP. You know, if I'm putting labels on things, I think Sunday Morning actually is my top EP of the year so far, but there's a few others that just aren't far behind. Obviously, RODERIK just continues to rise in my stratosphere and amongst the bands that everybody needs to have on their radar, and Tarnish is along those same lines. Two of my other favorites along those same lines are From the Haunt. It's a band that I've really talked about a lot on this podcast, especially last year when I was just starting up. They really have that pop rock sound kind of perfected, and the production behind that entire EP is amazing. And another one of my favorites was Greywind. Their EP stood out for many reasons, but one of the things that is really important for me to note is that Swing and Sway might just be my top track of the year so far. It is one of those tracks that it is undeniably catchy. It is absolutely gigantic, and I cannot wait for more people to continue to find this song and continue to connect with this band, because I think big things are on the way for Greywind. And then finally, there's a couple under-the-radar artists that released EPs this year. One of them is Free Friends, which are friends of the pod. They had a great collaboration with Sucker Punch on that EP, and just overall that they're starting to rise up my ranks as well as Set for Tomorrow. Set for Tomorrow has a song on that EP called Love Me Not, which is an absolute stud of a track, and those are two bands that if you are not aware of who they are, they need to be on your radar ASAP. So go check them out, Free Friends and Set for Tomorrow. But EPs are definitely coming on a little bit stronger now that we've gotten to the mid-year, but looking forward to what the rest of the year holds for EPs. And now we're moving on to everybody's favorite section, which is the albums. So I'm going to break this down in a couple of different sections, and then we'll finish with my current top 5 in no particular order, because if you try to make me choose right now, it's not going to end well because I cannot make that decision. The first category is albums that came out this year that I really appreciated from some of the veterans in the scene. So obviously we got Sum 41's album Heaven and Hell this year, which is double album, last album, all those different things. And again, it's just a very bittersweet goodbye to a band that's been around and has been such a stalwart in the scene for so many years. I think everybody that grew up listening to this type of music and still listens to this type of music realizes just how important Sum 41 was to the scene and is to the scene for that matter. One that I normally wouldn't mention, and I mentioned this back when I did the podcast, but I can't help but mention that damn acoustic Dayseeker album. It still is just creeping into every time I turn on a playlist. Somehow My Immortal's on there, somehow Sleep Talk's on there. It just doesn't make sense why I'm so intrigued by this album, but it continues to come back, and Dayseeker is a band that I get to see later this year live for the first time, so looking forward to that. We also got a really strong album from Neck Deep this year. Neck Deep started off the year so strong and kind of just set the bar for what has been such a really good year in pop punk and just the alternative scene in general. And then finally, from last week's pods, we had a return from the story so far. The story so far with one of the more emotional albums of the year, obviously all about loss, and there was a loss of a father from Parker, but man, I mean, that is just such a good, well-constructed album. And then when you put the emotions of what the band was going through at the time behind it and really listen, it makes it that much more special. The next section we're going to talk about in the albums is kind of the rookie section. So we just did the veterans, now we're going to do the rookie section in terms of first albums or very early on in their career. The Requiem, that album still is one that I kind of find myself teetering back to because I remembered loving it so much and I just haven't listened to it a lot recently, but I still get My Chemical Romance vibes every time I listen to that band. So I'm really excited to see what they have in store. Costin, another band from last week's pods. And this one I can say with definite certainty that in terms of the pop rock genre, Costin has the best album of the year so far. They don't think there's much of a contest just this point, but for my money, Costin has the best pop rock album this year. Very similar to me is this Costin album as Honey Revenge's Retrovision was for me last year. They both kind of came around in this like mid-year time frame, and it was just a little bit of a different sound and always just was kind of creeping up and starting to be one of my more listened to bands, one of my more listened to albums. So wouldn't be surprised to hear Costin in a end of the year list later on this year. Now, if we're talking favorite debut records, I don't think we have to look any further than Heartbent. They have come out swinging with their emo debut. One of my favorites this year in the emo metalcore-ish scene. And looking forward to potentially getting out to check them out live this year as well. They're usually a little bit closer and local to where I'm at in this area, so definitely looking to get out to a Heartbent show. Jasmine Bean is another one that had some of my favorite writing this year so far. They're an artist that I really started listening to last year and knew that we were going to get a debut album. And so really pleased with that entire album, and the writing on it is definitely one that makes you appreciate Jasmine as an artist. And then finally, the debut album from Jack the Underdog is one that you can really appreciate if you like production, in the sense that there's a variety of different productions and sounds on that album, and it's all very well put together, and it just has such a wide range of possibilities on that album that every song is going to be different, everything's going to sound very crisp, but you're never going to get the same track over and over again. The next section is just 3 albums that we talked about very recently last week, so I'm not going to go into great detail about them, but Your Broken Hero with their Emo Nostalgia album was fantastic. The artistry from Scene Queen on Hot Singles in Your Area is out of this world. And then just the unique sounds of Volume 1 by Sessions. I think those 3 albums are ones that I could very easily see rising up my board into top 20, top 10 kind of atmosphere. The next section is the just outside of my top 5 albums range, but absolutely rising up the ranks and could be well within it by the end of the year. First one in there is No Offense. Gibberish is the song that does it for me on that album. It's one of my top tracks of the year. It's probably going to end up being in my Spotify most played tracks of the year because there's just something about the kind of slow lead up to just the absolute blast into a mid-tempo chorus that works so well. Telltale. Telltale has one of the most complete albums of the year. It's one that fell out of my most played range because of all of this new music that we got recently, but I found myself wanting to listen to that type of music recently, and Telltale is absolutely the band that I reach for. See You Space Cowboy is a band that I did not expect to have the effect on me that they did, but god damn have I loved that album and all of the different features on it, and just the uniqueness that that band brings. It's very difficult to listen to a song like that and not realize that it's a See You Space Cowboy song. You're not going to mistake that band for someone else. It's very clear who they are and what their sound is, and it is a fantastic sound. Lolo, her new album is one of the most fun punk, rock, pop albums, however the hell you want to classify it. That is one of the most fun albums that you will listen to all year. It is definitely kind of this next generation of potential Avril Lavigne-like artists that are putting out music very similar to what Avril did back in those days. I can't talk about best albums of the year so far without talking about the best written album of the year so far, and that's from the early November. Obviously, I touched on that a lot last week, but Ace Enders and the rest of the band there just have this uncanny ability to evoke emotions out of you and just put yourself right and fully immerse you into this songwriting experience and just feel like you're going through that song, whether you have in your life, whether you've never done it in your life. That type of writing from the early November is hard to ignore. So that is the best written album of the year so far for me. Belmont's new album is one that I really struggled to keep out of my top 5, but when you hear my top 5, you'll understand why. The intriguing electronic sounds on this album are what makes it so different from anything else being produced in the scene right now. We have people doing kind of like this electro punk thing, but Belmont doesn't overdo it. It's always just a little change in the way that the electric guitar goes, or a little change in the way that the drum beats are played. There's always just something different that kind of stands out in a Belmont song. And hey, let's not forget that there's a SpongeBob reference in track 2, so it's hard to miss that as well. And then the last album in this section, which is killing me that it's not higher, but I just don't know what else to do with it, is the album from Too Close to Touch. This is an emotional farewell to a band that has just been through all kinds of hell in their past couple of years. They still had the energy and the ability to put out an album like this with collaborations with Bad Omens and The Word Alive that are just monster hits and monster songs that are just going to be all-time greats. There's no way around it. Hopeless and Novocaine are going to be all-time greats in the scene, much like we've kind of had in the past with more on the pop-punk side, like the Jamie All Overs and the Ocean Avenues. I very much see Novocaine and Hopeless as tracks that, in that metalcore atmosphere, are very much going to be ones that 20 years from now we look back and we say, damn, Novocaine is one of the best tracks of all time. All right, that brings us to the top 5. Again, there is no specific order to these. I am just reading off what I have as my top 5 favorite albums so far. these are absolutely going to change. They change by the day anymore at this point. But let's get into what my top 5 albums of the year are so far. First up, we're going to talk about Bring Me the Horizon. Now, when I did this review a couple of weeks ago, I very clearly stated that this was a great album, but a bit of a letdown at the same time. This album has grown on me a little bit. I've definitely found myself reaching for this, and I don't know it's because I'm reaching for a Bring Me track, or if it's because I'm reaching because I really do enjoy this album as a collection of Bring Me material. It's a weird one, man. It really is, because I don't know at the end of the year. I think everybody kind of naturally assumed that when we get a Bring Me the Horizon album, it's immediately going to shoot to number 1 on everybody's end of the year lists. And it didn't do that. I don't think it did that really for anybody. And it'll be interesting to see how some of the other people in the music world react to this album. But for right now, it's in my top 5. It's growing on me for sure, but we'll see what the end of the year brings. Next album in the top 5 is Knocked Loose. And who the fuck would have thought that I would have been sitting here talking about Knocked Loose in my top 5 albums at mid-year, and more than likely at the end of the year as well. I came into this podcast doing very strictly pop punk, punk rock, pop rock. Metalcore was probably as heavy as I went. And, you know, I listened to some hardcore stuff, but I didn't feel like I could even talk about it. But Knocked Loose really made me a believer in what the hardcore scene is, and not only that, but that people really want to hear these types of songs, and people are very much interested in this type of music. And that's really cool to see, because hardcore music gets a bad rap. People think it's just screaming and mosh pitting and knocking each other out in the middle of a concert venue, but that's not the case. This Knocked Loose album is fantastic. It is so well put together, it's well produced, it's well written, and I think if people just gave hardcore music a chance, they'd really love it. Imminence, with their new album. This album, I will continue to say, is a masterpiece. It very well could be my top album of the year, and this album very much feels like Take Me Back to Eden from last year. It's along those same lines where when you heard me talk about Sleep Token, it was the only thing that held that album back was the fact that I felt like I needed to listen to it all at the same time. I didn't feel like I could take songs out of order. The difference this year is that I feel like I can do that with this Imminence album, and I think that's why I appreciate it a little bit more. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Sleep Token hater at all. I love Take Me Back to Eden. I'm waiting for my damn vinyl to get delivered on that. But I feel like this Imminence album has that leg up that Sleep Token didn't at this point last year. Games We Play, making another appearance. That album, again, is just pop punk amazingness. I don't really have a good word for what I want to say about this album, but this is an unbelievable step towards what the next generation of pop punk should sound like and is going to sound like. Games We Play is really continuing the trend, kind of like we got last year, where we can see that the pop punk genre is going to be in very good hands with artists like Games We Play, Arrows in Action, Honey Revenge, Magnolia Park, The Home Team, who is my last album in this top 5. The Home Team released this album last week, and I had already had this podcast written. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. I had this podcast written. I had Too Close to Touch in the top 5, and the Home Team released Crucible of Life and absolutely fucked everything up, because I have not heard an album that has made that big of an impact on me upon first listen in quite some time. The Crucible of Life is, start to finish, one of my favorite albums potentially ever. I have not done a full review of this album yet, so I don't want to give too much away. That's next week's podcast, but the fact that upon a couple of listens, I'm willing to put that in a top 5 at a mid-year list without even giving a full review to you guys first is It's unbelievable to me. I mean, it really is. There's no other way to say that. Brian has just kind of wrecked everything with his vocals and with the writing style. And I'll get into more of why I really appreciate this album in that review. But the home team coming in with my last album in my top 5. So to review my top 5 albums so far in no particular order are Bring Me the Horizon, Knock Loose, Games We Play, The Home Team, and Imminence. All right, with that wrapping up the albums, I'm going to do a little bit of a rapid fire track listing here of songs that I've really been loving a lot this year, and they'll all be on a playlist at the end of this episode, so you guys can jump in and see if I'm missing anything, good songs this year that maybe I haven't put on there, anything like that, so let me know. First up, we got Nick Karcher. Nick has been releasing a steady stream of tracks. You're the One is probably my favorite, but stay tuned because we have I'm not even going to call it a remix, it's going to be a reimagined version, I guess, of Blame It on the Universe coming out next week, which is probably this week based off when this is going to get released. So a reimagined version of Blame It on the Universe with a feature from We the Kings. Big things happening from my man Nick, and I couldn't be happier. One of the best people out there. Mugshot by Huddy. Obviously, I wasn't a big fan of the whole EP, but Mugshot is still one of my favorite songs of the year and definitely coming up in that, top 10 range for me for some reason. Between You and Me had a really strong EP this year. In the Middle is my favorite track off of that. I think it's definitely worth a listen if you haven't heard it yet. Ignorance by Letters Sent Home and Dead Lakes, one of the better collaborations this year. We got new tracks from Arrows in Action. Both of those are great. We got new tracks from 408 off of that album. The album itself didn't really hit, but a song like Down definitely did. We also got a lot of new artists, or at least newer artists to me. First up, we got Straight Jacket Feeling with Nothing Left to Save. We got Middle Part with their song Superstar. We got Reese Young with their song Low. The brand new signing to Happy Haunting Records, Slideways with 3 Cheers. The list kind of goes on and on in terms of newer artists. But one of the ones that I really wanted to highlight was Daedra. I've mentioned that a couple times on the podcast that there's a couple of different tracks that Daedra's released that have just really kind of felt along the lines of the nu metal re-emergence that we've seen recently with kind of just this ode to Linkin Park. So going to have at least one, if not multiple of those songs on there. Check out Daedra. And then we got some of my personal favorites that had new songs come out this year. We got Gary Bender. Keep Breathing is probably the favorite, but at this point, all of them are so good. Gary's such a great person, and if you haven't heard any of Gary's music, please go check it out. It's well worth your time. Here Goes Nothing with their track Suffering is probably one of my favorite discoveries of the year. That is such a fun pop punk song that it's hard to not be pleased with a track like that. Mitch Rip, another friend here of the podcast, Car Sex is one of the most fun tracks, and if you have not seen the album art for Car Sex, do yourself a favor and go check that out. It is one of the most hilarious album artworks I've seen in a while. Trxvis with Thirst Trap, one of my favorites this year. Could have really went either way with either one of the tracks that Trxvis has released this year, but Thirst Trap I think is probably going to be the one that I gravitate towards. Magnolia Park, they've slowed down a little bit. I mean, hell, this time last year we were getting a track a week, and I feel like I've only gotten like 2 tracks in the 7 months. So I don't know what's going on with them, but after last year, they definitely deserve a break. But the new track Shallow is absolute banger status, and Magnolia Park is just so good and so destined to just continue to be a giant in this scene. Maybe Someday has a couple of new tracks out there that I really connected with. And then Maggie Lindemann with Hostage is just one of those tracks that's just so infectious that I find myself actually looking for that specific track more than many tracks that I've talked about already. Additionally, Walwin with, I'm putting T-Suite. I'm not saying that whole damn title because it's so long. It's very creative, but Walwin's new track is amazing. And then the last small grouping here of tracks that I want to talk about are ones that are definitely getting some mainstream appeal and are ones that you probably will hear everybody be talking about. Meds by The Used, definitely going to be one that you hear about a lot. Definitely more of old school Used than whatever we've gotten recently with, Toxic Positivity. Baby Metal, Ratata is absolutely potentially the song of the summer for alternative music fans, so don't be surprised to hear that. And then the collaboration between Rain City Drive and Dayseeker is one of those songs that is so infectious that it's hard not to see why that collaboration itself works so well. And we've had a lot of really good, really strong collaborations this year, and I think that's something that I'll potentially look at doing towards the end of the year, is doing, some of the best collaborations of the year as well. Unfortunately, when I wrote up this podcast, I didn't really think of that, and I didn't notice that we had so many great collaborations. But now looking back, we definitely had a lot, and it's worthwhile to point out what we've had this year. So that wraps it up for a mid-year album, track, live show tier list. So what has been your favorite album of the year so far? What's been your favorite track of the year so far? Have you discovered any new artists? Have you listened to any new tracks and really just kind of been blown away and they've basically become your favorite artist? I love hearing those types of stories, so please let me know if there's anybody that you've listened to. Also, let me know if there's anybody that you've learned about through my podcast. That is one of the most rewarding things that happens as a podcaster and just as an alternative music lover, is when somebody says to me, hey, I never knew about this band. You'd put me on to them and they've become like my favorite band. I just listen to their music nonstop. That makes it so worth it. And it's so fun to hear things like that. But with that being said, it's time to head out and let you guys listen to this and check out the different playlists. As always, thank you for listening, and I will see you next week with a review of the Home Team album along with Cassidy Pope and some of the other new albums that have come out in the past 2 weeks, and I will see you then.